for education in Belize. I am Candy Armstrong, and I work in the ministry as an education officer. I've been an educator for all my working career, and my interest was always student achievement. As a teacher within the system at the primary level, I was very concerned about repetition rate and the fact that in many cases, students were moved or they transitioned from one class to the next, but they did not necessarily meet some of the content standards, competencies, and skills at that particular level. What concerned me even more was the fact that the curriculum was a spiral approach, and competencies and skills were reinforced throughout approximately 8 years of education. Yet when students sit our national standardized exam, more and more we realized that they were not able to demonstrate at least adequate performance when the results were calculated. And so that was of great interest to me, because considering that primary education sets the foundation for higher education and for life in terms of your ability to read and understand, I was very concerned that so many of our students were exiting the system and they were not getting that good foundation in terms of the competencies and skills that they needed. And so then, I decided to examine levels of training of teachers at the primary level and assess their understanding of assessment, because first I thought that we had to have an understanding of what it is and what we are supposed to do, what were some of the practices in assessing student learning, and the use of the student assessment data to guide teaching. I thought that if we had a better understanding of that, there would be some indication of some of the gaps that we can fill, and it could inform some type of policy and practice. So then I will go through information that fed from the background all the way into the implications for policy and practice, to give you a summary of what was done, what were some of the results that I found out, and what are some of the implications for policy and practice based on what I found. In terms of the background then, when we look at I look first in terms of what was the Ministry of Education's policy as it relates to assessment, because I thought that if we are going to look at making a change, let us see what the policies say in order for us to have some type of legal backing to make a change in terms of more gains for the students. And so then, according to the Ministry's Handbook of Policies and Procedures, it states that assessment is guided by the belief that it's an integral part of teaching and learning of the teaching and learning process, and assessment practices have significant impact on and should enhance learning. Assessment should be focused on different aspects of a child's development and should be meaningful and relevant. Must be structured to support ongoing acquisition of knowledge, skills, and attitude. And so then, if we are saying that it is supposed to do all of these things, why is it that we are not able to get to a point where it becomes more relevant, where students' achievements are enhanced and where they are able to demonstrate some of what they have learned in terms of competencies and skills when they sit our national exams? And so, in the background, I looked at licensing of teachers, or how do we get a license in order to practice. This was prior to the new and the revised Education Rules 2012, and at that time, teaching licenses were of this category: provisional, special, temporary, and full. In Belize, we have a church-state partnership of education, and so it really means that the state, in terms of the government of Belize, pays the full salaries of teachers, but our schools are managed by a church denomination. And so we had that type of arrangement. We have the policy, and then we have the different types of licensing. And at that point, it wasn't mandatory that you were qualified before you entered the teaching profession. Trained teachers at that point, we had 42.5% with some level of training, and 38.5% were fully trained. Schools in the entire country, we had 294 primary schools and 2,948 teachers. The problem really for me was student underachievement on the primary school examination. Why is it that students go through approximately 8 years of education and are unable sometimes to read, to comprehend properly, and to demonstrate their levels of attainment on our primary school examinations? So in my research, I looked at some problem indicators. Was it an issue of monitoring and supporting the teaching learning process? So was the teacher reflective and monitoring his or her education environment in terms of teaching and learning? What role were principals and school managers playing? Looking at curriculum design and implementation, we talk about, right now the ministry has its ongoing, in revision, its success strategy that speaks to quality and relevant education. How are we measuring up in regards to quality and relevant? How is the curriculum being implemented in terms of engagement of teachers and students in the learning process? Then teacher assessment practices. What were those? How regular they were? Were they standardized? What was happening in terms of providing feedback to students? And then we look at teacher training. Are the teachers trained? Does that have any impact in terms of their ability to manage teaching and learning in their classroom? The purpose then, I just wanted to examine whether levels of training significantly impacted teachers' understanding of assessment, their practices for assessing student learning, and use of student assessment data to guide their teaching. So then, I looked at 5 levels in which I was looking for understanding of assessment, practices in assessing student learning, and use of student assessment data to guide teaching. In terms of a theoretical framework for my research, I looked at data-driven decision-making, because in data-driven decision-making, it speaks to the fact that persons within the learning community or educators always have questions, issues, or problems that they need data in order to analyze and examine and to make decisions. And so then I was saying, in this situation, if teachers are going to collect data on assessment, we need to understand what assessment is. In order for them to analyze it, there have to be a system in which it is being collected in an organized way. And that assessment information then should be used in terms of informing their practice. So after a lesson is taught and you collect data, what happens in the following lesson? What happens the following week or the following day? So how is that information being used? So the study was non-experimental. Again, the focus was identifying differences. And so I was looking at differences based on levels of training. And I had, was there a difference in terms of understanding of assessment, use of data and practices because of a teacher's level of training? Teachers who made up the population and sample for this study were only from the Belize district. The Belize district at that time had 66 schools, 834 teachers, and the population for this sample was 475. A survey instrument with a Likert type scale consisting of a forced response format made up of 10 questions were used. 10 options per question was used. I made a presentation to the teachers at a meeting. I invited them to volunteer to participate, and then I informed them in terms of the protection, and then I collected the surveys during the meeting at intervals and at the end. In terms of analyzing my data then, I use ANOVA, descriptive statistics, analysis of variance to compute. Now, as I said earlier, I was looking at differences. These were the 5 levels that the teachers were categorized into. Teachers who had a master's degree in education or a bachelor's in primary ed were in one group. Teachers with a trained teacher's diploma in another group. Those with an associate's degree in primary ed in a group. Certificate in education or level 1 training in a group. And those with no training in one group. Again, I was examining understanding of assessment, practices for assessing students' learning, and use of student assessment data to guide teaching. Thank you. So, were there differences? In terms of my first research question that examined understanding of assessment, when the ANOVA analysis was conducted, it indicated that there was a difference exists among levels of training. So there was a statistical difference. So then I did a further analysis using Tukey HSD to find out exactly where the difference was. And as is indicated by this graph, it showed that there was a significant difference between teachers who had an associate's degree in primary education and those that had no training. And so then, that was where I found a difference in response to my examination for research question 1. When I look at research question 2, I was looking for practices in assessing students' learning. What were the best practices that teachers were doing when they were assessing students' learning? And the results showed that there was no statistically significant difference among the group. So when the results were summarized and calculated, there was no difference. Similarly, for research question 3, it showed again that the results were not statistically different. So then there was no difference in use of assessment data to guide teaching based on the different levels of training. And again, we think about the person, the group in this sense, with the highest level of training, which was a master's degree in education or a bachelor's degree in primary education, and the one with no training, which, in terms of, which were the 2 spectrums. I also did a further analysis to see if there were other differences. And so I looked at gender, I looked at age, and I looked at experience. And again, the results show that there were no significant difference. And so then, looking at the results, I tried to come up with some possible conclusions. Because understanding of assessment is indispensable to the development of effective practices for assessing students' learning and for guiding teaching. And so then, in terms of exposure to training, as I mentioned earlier, there was a difference because the teachers who had an associate's degree in teaching demonstrated their scores showed the highest level of understanding of assessment, assessment practices, and use of assessment data to guide their teaching. And so I was thought then maybe there was some influence in terms of what happened during training. At the time when this study was conducted, there was, I think that teachers were exposed to best practices, and assessment in education then was also a recent trend. Advances in technology, both in terms of resource skills and available resources, could have influenced the fact that teachers who had this training were more exposed to assessment. And in addition to that, because it was assessment at that time formed an integral part of literature on education. From response to the survey instrument, it could also be inferred that teachers feel, because this is what one of the items that the few items that they rated very strongly. is that good assessments take time to create. Students have a variety of learning needs and styles, and assessment materials and methods must be diverse in order to better meet the needs of children. And so then, in terms of them having the teachers with an associate's degree in primary education, having a better understanding of assessment, better practices, and better use could have been influenced by their exposure to training and technological advancement and research skills. It was a bit surprising concerning the results of the teachers who had a master's degree in education or a bachelor's degree in primary education. For that group and the other group, I also wondered if there was an issue with application from theory to practice. So maybe it is that, they got the theory, but there was difficulty in terms of implementation when they got at the classroom level. In addition to that, the associate's degree in primary education and the certificate programs were new programs. And so considering assessment of existing programs and recent trends, there may have been more efforts on the part of the training institution in terms of what was being delivered in those programs, and some of the assessment best practices and methodologies must have also been a part of the faculty's modality when they were teaching. And so then that influenced the teachers' understanding and the practices that they use. Now, why did I think that my study was significant? Well, while doing my research, I couldn't find any similar research in Belize, so I felt as if though what I did would have added to the body of literature that we have already existing, right? The practical implication, I think that, again, because there was a difference in terms of understanding of assessment, practices and use with the teachers who had an associate's degree in education, in primary education, I felt as though that could have been an indication of acceptance of teacher candidates into the profession, like what is a minimum requirement that they should have in order to enter the profession. That teacher training institutions are aware of the effects of different categories of training on teachers' assessment knowledge. So why is it that the teachers who had a bachelor's degree or who came with a master's degree did not demonstrate that they had better assessment knowledge, better practices, and were using assessment data better than the teachers who had no training, if no other group? Contribute to teachers' knowledge of assessment, their practices in assessing student learning, and their use of data. Many research studies from my dissertation, it was the theory, a lot of theory was there and research. So I felt as if though when teachers read it, that would have added to their own knowledge of assessment. The need for training, further training or professional development for teachers in the areas of assessment, literacy, assessment practice, and the use of data, I think that was also significant. Teaching and assessment goes hand in hand. And so then if we're teaching and standardized results are showing that students are not learning, then there needs to be some type of filling of the gap there. Some limitations included generalizability, because as I said earlier, the study was only conducted with teachers in the Belize district. Triangulation, because of the way that I collected the data, teachers self-reported, and so this could have been strengthened in terms of validity and reliability had I been able to collect data from principals who actually observed those practices and probably from the students who were a part of the process. So there was no triangulation of data. Again, the validity and reliability, because it was a survey, it was really dependent on the respondents, how respondents candidly responded to the items on the survey. It was a self-reported method, and it's a method of convenience sampling. In terms of implication for policy and practice, I think at the ministry's level, it could have been, again, What is the minimum requirement for a teacher to enter the teaching profession? And look at professional development opportunities in terms of the areas that we see teachers need more professional development in. I thought that at the school level, maybe principals could use the teachers who have an associate's degree in primary education as coaches to help teachers within their school, and create opportunities for members of staff who are not trained to get a trained teacher's diploma. The teachers who have no formal training should be trained. Again, students should be involved in assessment processes, and the teacher practices should include a system of organizing and analyzing student assessment information. According to Assessment Reform Group, assessment for learning is the process of seeking and interpreting evidence for use by learners and their teachers to decide whether the learners are in their learning, whether they need to go, and how best to get there. We can only do that when teachers know how to do certain things, when we understand what assessment is and what we are supposed to do in that process, when we are able to do that and have best practices relating to assessment. And in addition to that, when we collect assessment, what do we do with the data? It should inform our instruction. Thank you.